Today we're going to look at the Waterbury Westminster chime clock. And I will say right off the bat that this is not the correct dial for this particular clock. This particular clock has the earlier style movement in it with the chime spring that winds counterclockwise. It does not have the indirect gearing or the barrel that the later movements have. It has the old style movement, which I have another example of right here. And this clock is running. I don't have it set to current time, but it is running. So, here's a view of the movement in one of these clocks. It's a what's known as a triple decker. There are 3 plates with 3 sets of gear trains. The front 2 plates house the conventional time and strike trains of your conventional American 8-day clock movement. This is a parts movement, so it's missing some things. You see I've robbed the springs off of it. It's got a good escapement. The fly for the chime train is missing on this one. And this does not have the correct size spring in it. It's a much smaller, it's actually the same size spring that would be used in one of the other trains. These use a larger spring for the chime movement. Even with the fly fan missing, it's not wanting to run. This movement's a bit on the dirty side. Might be in warning. But, and there's no hammers either. There's the pin barrel, the pins for the Westminster mechanism, but the hammers have been removed on this movement. They would this shaft here is where they would pivot on. So the way these work is the time side is strictly conventional for an American 8-day time and strike clock, and these use the semi-deadbeat escapement, which would have been pretty typical for most American companies on a mantle type clock, particularly the black mantles, to have a deadbeat instead of the recoil escapements. There's exceptions to this, of course, but that's generally the rule. And then the strike side is conventional for a standard 8-day time and strike movement. There's a few unconventional items, though. There are, on the center arbor, there are 4 lifting points. It has a 4-lobe lifting star. And the lifting star, so if I can get a view of it here. There it is down in there. The lifting star does not operate the strike train, it operates the chime train. There's a warning lever inside the front 2 plates that has a finger that sticks back and operates the warning lever on the chime train. This lever here, there's the locking lever. And the chime train is triggered directly by the time train in the front deck. At the end of the hour sequence, the chime train warns and releases the strike train. So it sort of passes from the back deck to the front deck in the operation of the clock. It's a pretty good example of the attempts that the various American clockmakers made to meet the craze for chiming clocks in the 19-teens and 1920s. And it was pretty well made. It's built just like any other 8-day American clock. Definitely built just like a Waterbury. You can see it's basically the plates of a conventional 8-day clock. It's just that this extra bit down here has been added to accommodate the main arbor for the chime side. Evidence of the much larger spring that the chime side uses is the double clicks on the great wheel of the chiming train. Patent pending. You know, the patent for this was granted sometime in the late teens, early 20s. You can look it up on Google. I'll put the patent number that was actually granted in the date in the description of this video. But so this is an earlier one. And this is what it's fitted into this case here. So the dial is wrong. So let's disturb it here. Let's turn it around. We can open the dial on the other side and advance it through the sequence a few times. So they made these in both this style, which I prefer, and they also made them in the tambour case style with the rods running horizontally. And that's the whole reason tambour clocks exist, is so they can have longer rods in them. The way these mount is a little unconventional, because in addition to the little feet under each of the pillar screws, they also have these cast iron brackets down here that run the full depth of the movement to help stabilize it. So if we advance the minute hand round to the next quarter, and this is going to be the hour coming up. I don't think our hour struck in agreement with the hand on the front, did it? Oh yeah, it did. Alright. These are manual, totally manual clocks. If they get out of sync, you've got to sync the trains up manually. No auto correction at all. It's count wheel on the strike, and count wheel, or locking plate as it's normally called when it refers to a chiming mechanism, locking plate on the chime, and then there's no auto correct. Later movements had rack and snail for the hour side, and still had the count wheel feature for the chime, but there was an auto correct feature added with one leg of the lifting star was longer, and that would be for the hour, and so it would auto-correct on the hour just like a most modern chiming clocks do. So in that regard, it's very similar to the Sonora chime clock. It's all count wheel operated. Of course, this clock still has the original wide spring, and I believe it's a little bit set on the chime side. You know, it does not seem to have the pep that it should. Watch the wheel up here whenever it locks. See, it sort of lazily bounces around. Rotate this, you can get a view of the locking plate on the chime side as it runs. A good action to everything, though. It's just it just seems a little lethargic when the train starts up. Like I said, I think the spring is a bit on the set side. I've looked at replacing these springs. They're an odd size and they're kind of expensive. See if I can get a little bit more light in there. There we go. So there's the locking plate. Now there is a lifting pin on the locking plate that comes into play on the hour, and that's what warns the striking train. You can see the pin down there at the bottom. You can see the pin, and you can see the little piece that it dropped was the warning lever for the strike. Go around one more time. And this little nub right here makes it a bit hard to see. Of course, that nub is not used on the back plate. That's the nub for the third wheel arbor bushing on the strike movement on the front plate. But the plates are identical, all three. They're just the holes that are drilled in them is different for each one. Rather ingenious movement. One of the claims made in the patent was that the movement was narrower than a conventional Westminster chiming movement would be, because the plates are triple, and so everything is sort of stacked behind each other. The extra gear train is added behind. And of course, you know, this is assumed on the fact that everything is built sort of in that large kind of scale that most American clock movements are built. On a German movement, yeah, the German movements actually are pretty wide. All the trains mounted side by side, but the gearing is a lot smaller, and the springs are a lot smaller, and everything's about 3/4 of the size of what they are in an American movement. Okay, there's that pin for the hour. It's going to come up, see it's warning the strike. It releases, and you can see the gears on the strike in the background running. So, very interesting clock this is. These Waterburys. They're pretty well made. Waterbury clocks, generally considered the vanilla of most American clocks. The generic kind of American-looking clock movement that's made by most of the Chinese and Indian companies making replacement movements for American clocks. The movements are sort of a copy of the Waterburys. And if you look at a Sessions movement, you could argue about the same thing about them. A Waterbury and a Sessions are pretty nondescript. They're pretty vanilla. They're sort of the generic American clock movement. Get into some of the other companies like New Haven or Seth Thomas or Gilbert. They're a little bit different, especially Seth Thomas. Very unusual movement shapes. Ingraham's movements, yeah, they're kind of vanilla too, but they're a little bit different. The way the count wheels operate on them is more similar to the older Seth Thomas clocks, and they were the last company to use a count wheel system like it was used on the early weight-driven OG clocks. I'll have to do a video with a Ingraham movement to show what's going on there, what I mean. But if you look at an OG clock movement and you look at a Ingraham movement, you'll say, "Oh, okay, I see what you're saying." But yeah, pretty interesting though. Like I said, several of the American manufacturers had these ideas on how to make a Westminster chiming clock movement, and they all patented them. They're all a little different. So, very interesting clock, a must-have for any collector's collection of American clocks. You're starting to get a little bit bored of just time and strike movements. You can go with one of these. They're good clocks. They're a little tricky to work on, but because of the way they're built, you basically approach it like you're working on two separate clocks, because you can assemble the time and strike side pretty easily and button that all up and make sure all the gears are timed on the strike side. When I first started working on time and strike clocks, I would mark the wheels, you know, where they were, how they were meshed with each other. But as I evolved in my skills, I quickly learned that is not the right thing to do. It's better to learn how to set it up, because somebody may have had it apart before you and not gotten it set up correctly. And if you go and put it back together, you're just repeating their mistakes. So it's better to learn how to set up the timing on these rather than try to just put it back together the way it was. But you can do the time and strike side first in the front half and put that all together and do the timing on the movement, and then you can put the do the chiming side independently, and it's totally independent. You don't have to let down the mainsprings in the front half to take the back half apart, and vice versa. So the only thing that is interconnected between the two is, as you can see, the arbor for the verge does run the full length of the movement. So obviously you'd have to bind the escape wheel to keep it from turning if you were taking the back half apart without messing with the front half. But if you want to take the front half apart, you don't have to do anything to the back half. You just take the screws out and to do what you need to do to secure the mainsprings, let them down, take the front plate off, and apart it comes. So pretty nice clock, pretty nice adaptation of the American way of building a clock movement and adapting it to a chiming clock. I like it. I think they're great clocks. Only got the one, but you know, it's a neat clock. And like I said, I don't like the tambour clocks because they take up a lot of space. I know they're not much wider than a black mantle clock, and I do like the black mantle clocks, but I do like this vertical case style a lot better. It takes up a lot less space on the shelf. So, alright, thank you for watching. From Oklahoma Bridges. That's all.